Saturday mornings at Whitmore Manor arrived with the punctuality of death itself. In the servants' quarters, they whispered of the curse that claimed brides like clockwork. Never on Fridays, never on Sundays, but always when the church bells struck noon on the Lord's day of rest. 7 wives had crossed the threshold of that accursed estate since 1923. 7 had vanished without trace, leaving only the echo of their wedding vows and the faint scent of withered roses in rooms that should have been filled with laughter. The Whitmore men continued to marry, as if driven by some terrible compulsion, and the village continued to provide daughters, as if memory itself had been bled from their bones. But memory, like blood, has a way of surfacing when least expected. Chapter 1. The Weight of Inheritance. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1938, its black letters stark against the cream paper like crows perched on fresh snow. Eleanor Hartwell read it twice before the words settled into meaning. Your engagement to James Whitmore announced. Wedding arrangements proceed. Manor awaits your arrival. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore. Eleanor had met James only 3 times, twice at the London Society gatherings her aunt insisted she attend, and once at the Savoy for what he had called a proper courtship dinner. He was handsome in the way that old portraits were handsome, static, formal, with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at her. When he proposed, it had felt less like a question and more like a statement of fact, as inevitable as the changing of seasons. Whitmore Manor, her Aunt Millicent had said with poorly concealed satisfaction, is one of the finest estates in Yorkshire. The family traces its lineage back to the Conquest. You're quite fortunate, Eleanor. But as Eleanor's train pulled into Whitmore Station on that grey November afternoon, fortune felt as distant as the sun behind the perpetual Yorkshire clouds. The station master, a wizened man with eyes like chips of flint, loaded her trunks with unusual haste. Begging your pardon, miss, he said, not meeting her gaze, but you'll be wanting to reach the manor before dark. The moors can be unwelcoming to strangers after sunset. The carriage that awaited her was magnificent and archaic, pulled by 2 black horses whose breath steamed in the cold air like the exhalations of demons. The driver, a man so pale he might have been carved from the Yorkshire stone itself, said nothing as they departed the village and climbed into the moors. Whitmore Manor rose from the landscape like a massive gravestone, its Gothic towers piercing the grey sky with the arrogance of the damned. Carved angels adorned every corner, their faces worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind until they resembled skulls more than cherubs. Above the main entrance, the Whitmore coat of arms bore a Latin inscription, Mors tua vita mea, your death, my life. Welcome to your new home, said a voice as Eleanor stepped from the carriage. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore stood in the doorway like a figure from a daguerreotype, tall, severe, dressed in black silk that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the dying day. Her smile was the kind found on marble effigies. James is in London on business, she continued, leading Eleanor through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors. He'll return for the ceremony on Saturday. Until then, you are my responsibility. Saturday. The word hung in the air like incense, heavy and cloying. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. That evening, as she sat in her assigned chamber, a room that had clearly been prepared for many previous occupants, Eleanor discovered a letter tucked behind the mirror. The paper was yellow with age, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. My dearest Mary, if you are reading this, then you too have been chosen. I pray you are stronger than I, cleverer than I, more blessed than I. The Whitmores speak of tradition, but what they practice is something far older and far more terrible. Watch the servants' faces when they think you cannot see. Count the portraits in the hall. There are 7 gaps where wives should hang. We are not the first, and God help us, we may not be the last. Trust no one who bears the Whitmore name. Victoria, 1932. Eleanor's hands trembled as she folded the letter. 7 gaps in the portrait gallery. 7 wives. And now she would be the 8th. In the darkness beyond her window, she thought she heard singing, a woman's voice, sweet and mournful, carried on the wind like a lament for the dead. Chapter 2. The Portrait Gallery of the Lost. The Whitmore family chapel stood apart from the manor house, connected by a covered stone walkway that Eleanor discovered on her third morning at the estate. Mrs. Cordelia had been conspicuously absent since the previous evening, leaving Eleanor to wander the vast manor like a ghost haunting her own future tomb. The chapel was older than the main house, its Norman arches bearing the weight of 8 centuries. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of extinguished candles and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded Eleanor of flowers left too long in water. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes of martyrdom, Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, Saint Agnes clutching the lamb of her purity, Saint Lucy holding her own eyes on a golden plate. But it was the crypt beneath the chapel that drew Eleanor's attention. The stone steps descended into darkness, and though every instinct screamed against it, she found herself walking down, into the heart of the Whitmore legacy. The crypt was circular, its walls lined with stone effigies of Whitmore patriarchs stretching back to the medieval period. Each tomb bore the same inscription, "Beloved husband and father." But there was something wrong with the arrangement, something that nagged at Eleanor's consciousness like a splinter beneath the skin. "There are no wives," she whispered to the shadows. "Not one." "Ah, you've noticed." Eleanor spun to find James standing at the foot of the stairs. In the dim light of the crypt, he seemed different, older, more angular, his handsome features carved with shadows that hadn't been there in London. "James, I didn't hear you return. The train arrived this morning. Mother told me you'd been exploring." He moved closer, and Eleanor caught that same sweet scent she'd noticed in the chapel. Flowers and something underneath, something organic and wrong. "This is our family's most sacred space. Every Whitmore son has been laid to rest here for 800 years. But where are their wives? Surely. Whitmore women aren't buried here," James said, his voice taking on the cadence of a recitation. "They return to the earth in their own way, according to their own tradition. It's quite beautiful, really. Quite natural." That evening, Eleanor finally understood the strange rhythm of the household. The servants, all of them local villagers who commuted daily from the village below, departed each Friday at sunset and didn't return until Monday morning. The manor's weekend staff consisted only of Mrs. Cordelia, James, and an ancient groundskeeper named Silas who lived in a cottage at the edge of the property. "It's always been this way," Mrs. Cordelia explained over dinner. "The Whitmore family values its privacy, especially on the Sabbath. We observe the old ways here: prayer, reflection, communion with our ancestors." After dinner, Eleanor retired to her room but found sleep impossible. The manor seemed to come alive after dark, filled with sounds that might have been the settling of old wood or might have been something else entirely. Footsteps echoed in the halls. Doors opened and closed. And always, at the edge of hearing, that woman's voice singing a lament in a language Eleanor couldn't identify. She rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name. The portrait gallery stretched along the manor's main corridor, lit by moonlight streaming through tall windows. Eleanor had walked this hall many times, but tonight she truly saw it. The portraits were arranged chronologically, showing the evolution of fashion and art across centuries. But there were indeed gaps, 7 of them, marked by empty frames with brass nameplates. Victoria Elizabeth Whitmore, 1932 to 1932. Margaret Rose Whitmore, 1929 to 1929. Constance Mary Whitmore, 1927 to 1927. Helena Grace Whitmore, 1925 to 1925. Millicent and Whitmore, 1924 to 1924. Catherine Jane Whitmore, 1923 to 1923. Sarah Louise Whitmore, 1923 to 1923. Each nameplate showed the same pattern, married and deceased within the same year. And at the end of the gallery, a new frame waited, its brass plate gleaming in the moonlight. Eleanor Frances Whitmore, 1938. The date of death remained unengraved, waiting. Eleanor's scream died in her throat as she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Silas, the groundskeeper, standing in the shadows like a specter. "They always discover the gallery," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "Always the gallery first, then the questions, then the understanding." But understanding comes too late, miss. Always too late. What happened to them? Eleanor whispered. Silas smiled, revealing teeth like old tombstones. They joined the family tradition, miss. They became part of Whitmore soil, Whitmore stones, Whitmore bones. They fed the legacy. I need to leave. I need to leave. Silas laughed, a sound like earth falling on a coffin lid. Miss, you're already part of the family. Have been since the day you accepted young Master James's proposal. The Whitmore line has needs, you see. Appetites. And Saturday. He paused, his smile widening. Saturday is feeding day. Chapter 3. The Ritual of Saturdays. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Instead, she sat by her window watching the moors stretch endlessly toward a horizon that never seemed to come. By dawn, she had formed a plan. Simple, desperate, perhaps futile, but a plan nonetheless. She would leave. Today. Before Saturday arrived with its terrible promise. But when she tried her bedroom door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed, as if the wood itself had grown together overnight. The windows, she discovered, had been painted shut for so many years that the glass had become part of the frame. She was a prisoner in a room that had held 7 prisoners before her. Mrs. Cordelia brought her breakfast on a silver tray, setting it down with the care of someone arranging flowers on a grave. You mustn't distress yourself, dear, she said, smoothing Eleanor's bed linens with maternal efficiency. Many of the girls became quite agitated as the ceremony approached. It's only natural. Marriage is such a significant change. What ceremony? Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. Why, your wedding, of course. Tomorrow is Saturday, your wedding day. James has been looking forward to it so eagerly. We all have. Mrs. Cordelia moved to the wardrobe and withdrew a wedding dress that Eleanor had never seen before. It was magnificent and terrible, ivory silk so old it had yellowed to the color of bone, intricate lacework that resembled spider webs, and a veil that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. This dress has been worn by every Whitmore bride since 1823, Mrs. Cordelia said with reverence. Each added her own touch, a stitch here, a pearl there. You'll be continuing a beautiful tradition. Eleanor stared at the dress and saw, with a clarity that made her stomach turn, the additions Mrs. Cordelia mentioned. The lace bore stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The pearls sewn into the bodice were discolored, some missing entirely. And the veil moved in a breeze that didn't exist, as if stirred by the breath of ghosts. I won't wear it, Eleanor said. Mrs. Cordelia's smile never wavered. Oh, but you will, dear. They all do in the end. The dress has its own ways of ensuring cooperation. That afternoon, Eleanor heard the preparations beginning. Footsteps echoed through the manor as furniture was moved, as something heavy was dragged across stone floors, as voices murmured in that same unknown language she'd heard in her nightmares. From her window, she could see Silas working in the chapel graveyard, digging a hole beside a weathered stone marker. But it wasn't a grave he was digging. It was too wide, too shallow. More like a ceremonial circle. As evening approached, Eleanor made one final discovery. Hidden beneath her mattress was a small journal bound in cracked leather. The first entry was dated Saturday, September 15, 1923. Today I marry Thomas Whitmore. I should be happy, but something in this house whispers of terrible things. The servants avoid my eyes. The portraits watch me with hunger. And Thomas speaks of old traditions, old hungers, old needs that must be fed. The handwriting changed with each entry. Saturday, October 20th, 1923. I understand now. The Whitmores aren't just a family, they're a covenant. The land sustains them, and they sustain the land. But the covenant requires sacrifice. Female sacrifice. Virgin sacrifice. Every generation, 7 brides must feed the foundation stones, must water the family tree with their blood. Saturday, November 17th, 1923, I tried to run. The Moors brought me back. They always bring the brides back. Saturday, January 12th, 1924, the ceremony isn't a wedding. It's a harvesting. The final entry was in different handwriting entirely, shaky and desperate. Saturday, March 8, 1932. If someone finds this journal, know that we tried to warn you. Each of us tried in our own way. But the Whitmores have been perfecting this ritual for centuries. The dressed bride must walk to the chapel at midnight. She must speak the vows that bind her not to her husband, but to the hungry earth beneath the altar. And then she becomes part of the foundation, part of the family, part of the curse that feeds their prosperity. The only escape is to break the circle. 7 sacrifices complete one cycle. But if the 8th bride refuses, if she finds the strength to deny them, perhaps the circle breaks forever. We could not be that 8th bride. Perhaps you can. Victoria, writing what may be my final words. Eleanor closed the journal as Friday became Saturday, as the church bells in the village began to toll midnight. She could hear them now, James, Mrs. Cordelia, and Silas, climbing the stairs to her room. Their footsteps were measured, ceremonial, like a funeral procession. The door that had been sealed all day opened without resistance. "It's time, my dear," said Mrs. Cordelia, holding the wedding dress like a shroud. "Time to join the family properly." Chapter 4. The 8th Bride. The wedding dress moved on Eleanor's body like a living thing, its fabric shifting and tightening with each breath. The ancient silk whispered against her skin, and she could swear she felt the heartbeats of the 7 women who had worn it before her, frantic at first, then slower, then stopping altogether. Mrs. Cordelia had arranged Eleanor's hair with the same meticulous care one might use to prepare a body for burial, weaving dried flowers into the braids, flowers that smelled of earth and endings. The veil fell over Eleanor's face like a spider's web, its yellowed lace creating patterns of shadow and light that made the world seem already half departed from reality. "Beautiful," James said as he saw her. But his eyes held no warmth, no love, no recognition of her as anything more than a vessel to be filled and emptied. "Father will be so pleased." "Your father is dead," Eleanor said. "Death is merely another room in the Whitmore house," James replied. "Tonight you'll understand." They led her through corridors that seemed longer than before, past portraits that turned to watch their procession, down stairs that descended deeper than Eleanor remembered the manor having. The walls grew older as they walked, stone replacing wood, medieval masonry replacing Georgian elegance, until they moved through passages that predated Christianity itself. The chapel they entered was not the Norman structure Eleanor had visited before. This was something far older, carved from the living rock beneath the manor. Pagan symbols intertwined with Christian imagery, Celtic spirals wound around crucifixes, ancient fertility goddesses embraced virgin martyrs, and everywhere the Whitmore coat of arms, Mors tua, vita mea. 7 stone altars ringed the chamber, each bearing a different name, each stained with something dark that had seeped into the rock itself. And at the center, an 8th altar waited, carved with fresh precision from Yorkshire stone. "The ceremony is simple," Mrs. Cordelia explained, lighting candles that burned with an unnatural blue flame. "You'll speak the vows that every Whitmore bride has spoken. You'll drink from the cup that binds you to the family. And then you'll lie down on the altar and allow the manor to embrace you fully." "And if I refuse?" Mrs. Cordelia's laugh echoed off the stone walls like the cry of a dying bird. "Refuse? Oh, my dear, you cannot refuse. The dress won't let you. The vows won't let you. The very stones of this place won't let you. 7 brides have learned this truth before you." Eleanor felt the dress tightening around her, its fabric constricting like a serpent. The veil began to pull at her hair, drawing her head down in a gesture of submission. But as she fought against the dress's supernatural compulsion, her hand brushed against something tucked into the bodice, Victoria's journal, hidden there when Mrs. Cordelia had forced her into the gown. "The only escape is to break the circle. I speak the vows of my own free will," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber. "Is that not correct?" James nodded, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Free will makes the sacrifice sweeter. The manor feeds on willing offerings." "Then I offer my will freely," Eleanor said, and opened Victoria's journal. "I offer the will of Catherine Jane Whitmore, who died here in 1923. I offer the will of Sarah Louise Whitmore, who died here in 1923. I offer the will of Millicent and Whitmore, who died here in 1924. With each name, Eleanor felt a presence gathering in the chamber, a cold wind that came from no earthly source, shadows that moved independently of the candlelight. The stone altars began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like spider webs across their surfaces. "Stop," Mrs. Cordelia commanded, but her voice had lost its authority. Eleanor continued, "I offer the will of Helena Grace Whitmore, who died here in 1925. I offer the will of Constance Mary Whitmore, who died here in 1927. I offer the will of Margaret Rose Whitmore, who died here in 1929. I offer the will of Victoria Elizabeth Whitmore, who died here in 1932. The 7 altars shattered simultaneously, their broken stones scattering across the chamber floor. The blue flames of the candles turned white, then gold, then blazed so brightly that the ancient symbols on the walls began to smoke and char. "And now," Eleanor said, feeling the wedding dress beginning to dissolve like morning mist, "I offer my own will, not to feed your hungry earth, but to starve it. I refuse the Whitmore name. I refuse the Whitmore covenant. I refuse to be the 8th sacrifice." James lunged toward her, his handsome features melting away to reveal something far older and more terrible underneath, skin like parchment, eyes like empty sockets, teeth like the scattered bones of previous victims. But Eleanor was no longer bound by the dress, no longer compelled by the ancient magic that had claimed 7 women before her. She ran. Behind her, the stone chamber filled with the sound of breaking. Not just the physical breaking of stone and timber, but the breaking of something far more fundamental. The covenant that had sustained the Whitmore family for 8 centuries was cracking like ice in spring thaw. Eleanor burst from the chapel into the Yorkshire dawn, the journal still clutched in her hand. The manor house behind her groaned and shuddered, its Gothic towers swaying like trees in a storm. Windows shattered. Gargoyles fell from their perches. And from the crypt beneath the chapel came a sound like screaming that might have been the earth itself crying out in hunger denied. She didn't stop running until she reached Whitmore Station, where the same wizened station master who had greeted her arrival now watched her departure with something that might have been respect. "Broke the circle, did you?" he said, loading her hastily packed bag onto the London train. "About time. About bloody time." As the train pulled away from Yorkshire, Eleanor looked back once to see Whitmore Manor silhouetted against the morning sky. But where the ancient house had stood for centuries, now only ruins remained, broken stone and scattered timber, as if the building had simply forgotten how to exist. The 8th bride had refused her role. The circle was broken. Or so Eleanor believed. Epilogue. The seed of new traditions. From the Yorkshire Post, November 15, 1958, 20 years later. Local heiress announces engagement. Miss Patricia Whitmore, sole surviving member of the ancient Whitmore family of Yorkshire, announced her engagement yesterday to Mr. Geoffrey Ashford of London. The wedding is planned for this Saturday at the newly reconstructed Whitmore Chapel, which was rebuilt on the foundations of the family's ancestral estate following the mysterious collapse of the original manor house in 1938. Miss Whitmore, who inherited the family properties following the disappearance of her cousin James Whitmore 20 years ago, has spent considerable fortune restoring the estate to its former glory. "The Whitmore legacy must continue," she told our correspondent. "Some traditions are too important to let die." The chapel reconstruction uncovered several interesting archaeological finds, including a collection of medieval artifacts and what appears to be a burial chamber containing the remains of 7 unidentified women. These remains have been respectfully interred in the new family crypt, where they will watch over future generations of Whitmores. Local residents report that the restored estate has brought new prosperity to the region, with crops growing more abundantly and livestock thriving as they haven't for decades. "It's like the land was sleeping," said one local farmer, "and now it's waking up hungry." The wedding ceremony will be conducted according to traditional Whitmore family customs, with the bride wearing the family's ancestral wedding gown, recently discovered in remarkably preserved condition in the estate's archives. Miss Whitmore's fiancé, Mr. Ashford, could not be reached for comment. From the private diary of Eleanor Hartwell, now Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, November 16, 1958. I read the announcement in yesterday's paper and felt the old chill return, the same cold that plagued me for months after my escape from Yorkshire. I had hoped, prayed, that breaking the circle had ended the Whitmore curse forever. But curses, it seems, are like seeds. Cut them down, and they only scatter to grow elsewhere. Patricia Whitmore. I remember the name from the family genealogy James once showed me, a distant cousin, raised in Scotland, far from the manor's influence. Or so I believed. But the Whitmore blood runs deep, and it carries with it hungers that transcend distance and time. The wedding is tomorrow. Saturday, as always Saturday. I have written to the authorities, but what can I tell them? That in ancient family practices ritual murder disguised as marriage? That the Yorkshire soil thirsts for virgin blood? They would think me mad, and perhaps they would be right. After 20 years of normal life, of loving my dear husband William and raising our children, sometimes I think I dreamed the entire episode. But then I remember the journal, still hidden in my bureau drawer. I remember Victoria's desperate warnings and the weight of that cursed wedding dress. I remember 7 empty picture frames and the sound of the earth screaming when its hunger was denied. Tomorrow, another girl will walk down another aisle, carrying flowers that smell of endings. Another bride will speak vows that bind her not to love, but to an appetite that has waited 20 years to feed again. I have done what I can. I have written letters to newspapers, to police, to anyone who might listen. But who believes in curses in 1958? Who credits old wives' tales in an age of atomic power and space exploration? The Whitmore legacy continues, as it always has, as it always will. The circle was not broken, only relocated. Only renewed. And somewhere in Yorkshire, the 8th bride prepares for her wedding, wearing a dress that carries the dreams and screams of 8 women before her, walking toward an altar that has waited 20 years for its next offering. Saturday comes. Saturday always comes. The manor may have fallen, but the Whitmore hunger endures, patient as stone, certain as death, inevitable as Saturday morning. Mors tua vita mea. Your death, my life. The covenant continues,